Good morning, everyone. My name is Herman Pretorius, and I'm the Deputy Head of Policy Research for the Institute of Race Relations. And I firstly want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. All our friends in the media, from the press, I see the numbers ticking over quite nicely in this call. Very welcome to you specifically. Thank you for taking us up on this invitation. I want to thank the colleagues who are joining us this morning, also the people who are watching on the other platforms we are streaming this to. How this will work is primarily, it is a press briefing, it is a press event. So the prime focus will of course be given to the people immediately in this call. But we look forward to interactions with members of the press in attendance, but also with members of the public who might be following us on any of the other platforms like Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. The reality of South Africa is an uncomfortable one, and it has been uncomfortable for a very long time, and no organization is quite aware, or has historically been quite aware, as much as the Institute of Race Relations, as to what has gone wrong in this country and what can go right. The Institute was founded in 1929 with a very clear objective to understand race relations in South Africa, identifying it even 20 years before the start of apartheid, that race relations really would form a heart and sole issue of this country's failure or success. Failures we have seen many of, successes we have seen some of, but successes we at the Institute of Race Relations believe can be repeated and even surpassed. The reality is that we are currently in a state of great uncertainty, a state that has been brought about by really government power becoming more of a problem than a solution. This hasn't been the case in South Africa so often that it is often easy to miss that fact. We have seen some successes of government, and we at the Institute of Race Relations have never been shy to acknowledge those successes. And oftentimes we have drawn criticism from people who would be considered our ideological allies, because we have been willing to grant the successes of governments and of other organizations when it was against public narratives to do so. It was uncomfortable for an organization to oppose the government for the 70 years before 1994. And it has been an uncomfortable experience since. And the reason isn't that the IRR seeks out uncomfortability or any form of infamy. It is because while everything else changes, the nature and importance of freedom and individual freedom, equality before the law, prosperity, these things remain unchanged in the priorities of our people. So, when we look at these priorities of our people, what do we see in 2020? To understand that, we have to look back to the last 10 years. If we want to look forward to the next 10 years, we need to make sure we understand why we are where we are now. That is what priorities this morning's briefing by Dr. Anthea Jeffery will be about. I thank Anthea for her presence and her vast research on this issue, on this topic. She is, to my mind, without a doubt, the foremost expert on policy and ideology in this country, and especially when it comes to the ANC, probably the world. I think she knows the mind of the ANC better than the ANC itself. And she has asked me repeatedly to refer to her as Anthea, so having referred to her as Dr. Anthea once, I will from this point on adopt the informality that is demanded of me and saying Thank you, Anthea, for your time this morning. Thank you for your preparation. We look very much forward to listening to you this morning, sharing with us your insights, your analysis. And last word from me before I really hand over to Anthea on this is how this morning will work. After this introduction of mine that seems to have already gone on long enough, I will hand over to Anthea, who will really begin her presentation. But in order to make this interaction not just a one-way stream, as it were, as interesting as those one-way streams are, especially when coming from someone like Anthea, we have decided to allow a more conversational approach this morning, where I will be as it were, a conversation partner to Anthea, asking questions, posing a question here and there, and really getting the accessibility factor as high as possible. After that, when Anthea and my conversation has concluded, I will open the digital floor, or the electronic floor, as it were, to questions from our friends in the press in attendance. There is a chat function in this call. If you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen where all these names and avatars appear, then about, I gather, a fifth of the way from the bottom of the screen, there should appear a little bar. And it has a red hang up button to the far right of the bar. Please don't press that. But that is just a point of reference. To the left of that button, there's a little icon that says Show Participants if your mouse hovers over it. And then to the left of that, there's a Show Conversation button that looks like a speech bubble. If you want to ask a question, please type into the chat function here that you want to ask a question. You do not have to type out the question. The reason is really I want to be able to see that you want to ask a question and then refer to you, give you the mic, so that in your own voice, your own wording, you can put that question to Anthea or if or myself if that might be unlikely but appropriate. So all the formalities to one side. Thank you very much, Anthea, and yes, let's kick this off with your initial thoughts.
Thank you, Herman, and good morning to everybody attending, and many thanks for coming along. And I'm sorry that we can't actually still meet face to face, but I do appreciate your attendance, particularly at this time as we're coming out of the lockdown. How we now revive the economy is so crucial. And as Herman said, we need to understand where we've come from and where we might yet be going. And this slideshow is an attempt to unravel those issues. It's based on a much longer document, which will soon be available on the website. And it is, of course, a very truncated version, but I hope that it captures the key points. And my technical problems have just begun, because now all of a sudden it will not move when I ask it to.
And I think
which means I think I might have to stop presenting and then open it again.
All right.
Let me just try that.
These technical issues have rather become a plague, but wonderful. I think we have success.
That looks better. That looks better. Thank you. Thank you. Just froze. Like me, cold up. So what we're talking about is it's not just a COVID-19 lockdown. We know, of course, that the COVID-19 lockdown has largely been lifted since the 1st of June, with very many businesses now able to operate under a rather smaller category of those which still can't do so. But South Africa, in our view, has also been in an unacknowledged policy lockdown for at least the last 10 years. And especially since Jacob Zuma as president embarked on a program of radical economic transformation, or RET. This reflected the fact that he had shown his commitment to RET before he became president, why the SACP therefore helped him to power. And I think it's widely assumed that there are ET agendas on the back foot since Cyril Ramaphosa assumed the presidency. But to my mind, he is also deeply committed to this. This is also why the SACP helped facilitate his rise to the presidency. And he has recently stated quite clearly in an address in Stanger earlier last month that he wants radical economic transformation to underpin the country's COVID-19 economic reconstruction. And we'll come back to that. The upshot is that we've had ever more damaging policies implemented over the over the past decade, and the economy has increasingly been hobbled by them. And now, of course, we have the fact that the lockdown has simply pushed it over the edge and crippled it. We were already in a technical recession when the lockdown began. We immediately lost our last remaining investment grade rating. But now, after 10 weeks or so of lockdown, what we see is really scary projections of our GDP, that it can contract by between 10% and 17% this year. The joblessness, according to Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, could rise to 50%. The IMF has given warnings about where public debt is going. As it sees it, we'll have a budget deficit this year of 13.3% of GDP, and the overall burden of the debt to GDP will rise to 86% in 2021. In addition, according to S&P, the ratings agency, the government's interest bill on all that debt is going sharply up too. So whereas it absorbed 14% of government spending last year, it will take 22% of government spending in 2023. And that's a rather frightening figure too.
Anthea, perhaps I could ask you a question at this stage. When we're working with that last point specifically, the lockdown has crippled it. By that you mean this more narrow COVID-19 lockdown, coming on the back of the state of GDP, of joblessness, of public debt, really heading into this crisis.
Exactly, Herman. Yes, the slide could be clearer. Of course, it's the COVID-19 lockdown on top of the policy lockdown that has had this particularly devastating impact. If I could move then on to trying to understand the policy lockdown. We know that South Africa had huge potential for growth in 1994 when apartheid finally ended, but that potential has never been fully realized. And the problem is not just that South Africa's policies are uncertain, as many commentators say, meaning either that it takes them too long to be decided, or that they are too vague when they are introduced, or that they are poorly implemented, as many commentators also say, that we have excellent policies, the problem is with their implementation. In our view, the situation is very different. We have bad policies, and it's the bad policies that have so helped to cripple the economy. And those bad policies are very much rooted in the National Democratic Revolution, or NDR, to which the ANC and the SACP formally committed themselves in the early 1960s. But this is not just an historical phenomenon, because the commitment to the NDR still goes on, and the SACP continues to use its dominance over the ANC to set the agenda for the ruling party. And both of them regularly recommit themselves to the NDR. The ANC does so 5-yearly at every one of its national conferences since 1994. So most recently it did so at the NASDAQ National Conference in December 2017. Most South Africans, unfortunately, have very little knowledge of the NDR, which is largely ignored by commentators, and so its full significance is simply never communicated to people. And yet the NDR is the glue that holds the ANC factions together. In a nutshell, we have a more purist leftist faction, to which the SACP and Mr. Ramaphosa belong. And on the other hand, we have a more of a state capture faction, which is looking more for the opportunities for self-enrichment through increased state power. But NDRs are nevertheless the common ground on which they can both agree upon, and so the glue that helps to hold the ANC together. And the overall goal, in a nutshell, is to control the private sector in time to cripple the capitalist economy so as to pave the way to socialism, I beg your pardon. The ANC is very well aware, which of course makes sense, that that shift from our at present 70% capitalist economy is unlikely to happen. If the economy is growing strongly, if many people have jobs, if education is sound, if people are thriving with their living standards going upwards, they're very unlikely to have any interest in a transition to socialism. By contrast, when things are going really badly, when unemployment is up, when poverty is far worse, when hunger is on the march, that's when the false promise of socialism is likely to have much more appeal.
Anthea, might I stop you there for a moment, because I must ask you a question. When you say President Ramaphosa is part of the leftist faction, the ideological faction with the Communist Party, I can almost hear the outrage and the cries of defiance from much of the analyst and public commentariat, and perhaps also a large part of middle class South Africa, saying that this man he must be a capitalist. He is a very successful businessman. He delivers nice speeches with great capitalist sound bites sometimes, things like boosting investment, and unleashing entrepreneurial growth and SMMEs. How can you possibly, in the face of such evidence, say that Mr. Ramaphosa is an ideologue along the lines of the SACP?
Well, I think one has to look behind the packaging, and I think Mr. Ramaphosa is a very skilled communicator. And he has, of course, been involved in the business world, but less as an entrepreneur and more as a BEE partner, which I think is really a very different thing. But if you look beyond the packaged messaging, Mr. Ramaphosa has himself described himself as a committed socialist. He himself has endorsed the NDR from time to time. And more than anything else, I think one can judge people by their actions where their words cause confusion. And if one looks at the policies that have been introduced since Mr. Ramaphosa became president in 2018, there really is no sign of Ramaphosa as the real structural reformist, unfortunately. He's spoken of a new dawn, but that, of course, could take many shapes. He's spoken of structural reform, but that could also have very many different forms. And what has happened since he became president is that we've had the introduction of many policies which are damaging to investment and growth, particularly the expropriation without compensation policy, which Mr. Ramaphosa, if he really wanted to put an end to it, could have spoken out very strongly right from the start. Despite a small margin in the ANC in that election which elected him as president in 2017, there was a huge amount for support for him in the country as a whole, the belief that he's a reformer, and he could simply have started using that support and his own communication skills to warn about all the things that are wrong with EWC and so to nudge his party away from it. Instead, he's embraced it repeatedly and seemed to have an enthusiasm for it. So I think that Mr. Ramaphosa, the reformer, is simply something that we've been led to believe, but is not true, except that the reforms might be in the direction completely opposite from what most people would want.
So I think it's an issue of walking the walk and talking the talk. He certainly does talk the talk, but the substance doesn't support his talk. And last question from my side before I let you go on is there's a suspicion about this NDR ideology, and I must say when I started at the institute, I also kind of thought it might be a bit of a not fanciful, but something that is conspiratorially imposed after the fact. perhaps now would be a good moment just to ask, is the NDR a strategic plan that is hatched continually by cadres in smoke-filled rooms, or is it just an ideological framework that is similar to all other ones, that people base their decisions on, sometimes consciously, sometimes even subconsciously? Because when one says the National Democratic Revolution and you identify it, I think many people might think, but my goodness, this does sound a bit cloak and dagger.
It's cloak and dagger in the sense that I think it's not that well communicated to ANC members either, many of whom have a vast preference for business-friendly policies, for example. But I have no doubt that within the inner core of the ANC and the SACP, there is a group of people that very well understands what the NDR goals are and how they have to be attained bit by bit. What makes it more difficult to understand is this is not a 5-year plan. It's not something that you can begin and end in anything like that period. It's supposed to be implemented over a period of about 40 years, perhaps even longer. And though the overall objective is clear, there's a recognition that in each 5-year period, you have to see which of those objectives can be attained within the period immediately ahead of you, what the balance of forces is likely to allow. In other words, what are the surrounding circumstances that either make it easier to press on with NDR goals or more difficult to do so. And that balance of forces is weighed very carefully by the ANC and the SACP, both as regards domestic factors and as regards global ones. And when the opportunity is there, a push will be made for another NDR policy. And if enough resistance is encountered, then the ANC might have to take a step back, but with the aim that in time it will be able to take 2 steps forward. It's a mental process which is unfolding. And I think it's not a secret in the sense that the policy documents of both the SACP and the ANC are very frank about NDR goals. But often there's a sort of mixture of the rhetoric. Some anti-private sector, business is the enemy wording will be used. And sometimes you'll have the sort of messaging that you referred to before, when Cyril Ramaphosa in particular talks about a partnership. I think increasingly we're seeing that if there is any kind of partnership, it's one in which the ANC intends to provide the guidance at the very least, and which it intends to discipline capital if possible, as we'll see later on in the presentation. So I think if we can move on.
Yes.
What I'm planning to do, I've highlighted here labour laws. It's impossible to look at every aspect of the NDR. It's been implemented since 1994 in probably 20 different policy areas, some of them more political, some of them more economic. I simply want to take 3 areas because they're illustrative, so very important also to the economy's capacity to grow. So let's just go through my slides on labour law, and then I'll also be dealing with BEE and employment equity, and then with property rights, all as key arenas in which the NDR is playing out. So if we start with the labour laws, the labour legislation, what are the goals here? Well, I think one must begin by recognising that in NDR thinking, the primary motive force of the NDR is the black working class, both employed and jobless. And I think and jobless is important too. I think most people tend to assume that there's only the employed working class that are important to the revolution, but it's the jobless black poor who are particularly important to it too. And so one of the consequences is it doesn't matter that much if joblessness goes up, because even those who are unemployed are still a critical part of the motive force pushing for the NDR. And what the aim is to use the working class and other motive forces to help attain what the SACP describes as a socialized society. This is an interim stage on the road to socialism. The private sector will still be present, But the socialized component, in other words, that part which puts social needs before private profits, is dominant and hegemonic, they say. So we'll talk quite often about putting social needs before private profits in other parts of this presentation in order to give examples. But in essence, one key point to be made is this, that if a private business keeps needing to put the needs of people before its own capacity to bring more in than it pays out in expenses, then that private entity cannot survive for long. It will become bankrupt. So the more it happens that the private sector is pushed into a situation where its costs are higher than what it can bring in, the more the private sector will go to the wall and cease to exist. Then the NDR basically sets out various tasks for those in the black working class who do have jobs. Part of the focus is to agitate for wage increases without regard to whether these are in line with productivity gains. It's important also to resort to strikes at times, partly, of course, to obtain those wage increases, also because it does put pressure on the private sector. The aim is that in time, the power of trade unions and workers should increase to the point where they can effectively dictate to their employers not only on wages and working conditions, but also on investment decisions. And for those in the public sector, it's very important to resist any attempt at privatization or downsizing, and rather to promote the importance of the developmental state as a key actor in this socialized economy to which we are moving. But the jobless are arguably even more important to the NDR. They allegedly show the failures of capitalism. They depend very heavily on the state. They rely on it for social grants, often for the wider social wage, such as free education, free basic electricity and water. They can be de-linked, says the SACP, from the capitalist economy over time by providing them with alternative ways of making a living. And this would happen in particular, say, in survivalist cooperative enterprises, in townships or in rural areas. In rural areas, for example, the idea is that we should go further with 1 hectare, 1 household strategy, where people who are now very poor and often hungry will have the opportunity to earn their own living, but it will be, and grow their own food, but it will be a marginal living at best. And they will be organized into cooperatives. They will not have individual ownership even of the plot of land they work. And they will entirely depend on the state to provide them with all the inputs that they require, which means, of course, that they might battle very significantly to have outputs for themselves or for the cooperative markets that will also be established. So if I can move on to the next one, perhaps it's better to do it all in one go. Then, so what are the NDR policies that are being used in this particular sphere, and what is their economic impact? Well, we have, for example, the Labour Relations Act, which has closed shop provisions. In other words, people might have to join a union in order to get employment. It provides for blanket coverage, and this is particularly damaging to small businesses. In other words, the wages and working conditions that are agreed by big unions and big business are then extended to much smaller enterprises which simply can't afford them. But because they're binding, they must either retrench workers, or if they absolutely cannot survive, they must go to the wall. There are also major constraints on dismissals and retrenchments, and those are a great deterrent to hiring, because business will need at times to dismiss its employees, either because a particular individual turns out not to be suitable, or in a time like this, where there's great economic distress and it's important to retrench in order to retain the balance of the jobs. The LRA also makes it very easy to strike, simply by the giving of notice, and some attempts to resolve it before the strike is resorted to. And there is, unfortunately, a very widespread use of violence during strikes. This is now supposed to be guarded against by a new provision to the LRA, which says that unions have to have a provision in their constitutions for secret ballots before they embark on a strike. But there seems to be no penalty if they don't comply with that secret ballot obligation, because the LRA also says that no strike is unlawful or loses its protection because a ballot hasn't been held. So it's a gesture in the direction of trying to reduce violence and strikes, but really little more than that. Then we have the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the National Minimum Wage Act, and together these push up employment costs, and increasingly there's a risk that they price the unskilled out of jobs. And this is a problem that the ANC itself is well aware of, that crops up, for example, in the National Development Plan, where it was recognized that entry-level wages are so high that employers are very reluctant to take on the young people with no experience because they're simply not worth what they're obliged to pay them. So the higher we push up the entry-level wages, the more we push out the unskilled from the labour market. There's also the idea, of course, very strongly articulated by COSATU, part of the alliance too, that the minimum wage now laid on, which is 20 Rand 76 an hour at present, is a precursor to a living one, which would need to be much higher. If you look at some of the figures on employment, Black people with jobs numbered 5 million in 1994 and 12.3 million in 2019 at the end of the year. So this was a rise of 146%, which also gives the lie to what COSATU, for example, often complains of jobless growth. But the number of people, Black people who are jobless, has grown up even more. So from 1.6 million in 1994 to 5.9 million in 2019, which is a rise of 264%. And when one looks at the official jobless rate, before I get to that, on the expanded definition, which counts people who are too discouraged to keep on looking for jobs, we have 9.3 million Black people who were jobless in 2019. And if we look at unemployed people of all races, then the total was 10.3 million, which is really a staggering number. The official jobless rate is 29%. Among youths, people aged 18 to 24, it's very much higher at an even more worrying 56.4%. If I move on then to the further impact of labour laws, there have been peak years when the number of man days lost to strikes was particularly high, and to give just two examples, 4.6 million man days lost in 2010 when there was a big public sector strike, 11.8 million in 2014 when there was a 5-month strike in the platinum industry, where the workers affected by that are unlikely ever to be able to recover the wages that they lost in that period. Because strikes are so violent, they can in fact mean the death penalty for many workers, as Gwede Mantashe said a couple of years ago when he was still ANC Secretary General. The most violent strike was in 2006, when 69 non-striking security guards were killed, and there was almost an incitement to violence from Zwelinzima Vavi, who was then the head of COSATU, in describing them as rights who basically needed to be exterminated. South Africa ranks low on the World Economic Forum's 2019 Global Competitiveness Index report, so we come 139th out of 141, second last for cooperative relations, 134th on wage flexibility, 129th on hiring and firing. And this in a situation where the South African economy makes up 0.5% or so of the global economy, and potential investors have very many other options from which to choose. This record is not an encouraging one. And what happens, of course, with a very large number of jobless Black people, 9.3 million at the end of 2019, no doubt much higher now after the COVID lockdown, they're heavily dependent on the state. As I was saying, they need social grants to survive. The social wage also helps. We don't have a general grant for the unemployed, so that adds to the sense of desperation among the joblessness. And people rarely in that position have very little hope of what the future holds for them. It's also possible that jobless Black youth can be mobilized for mass action. I'm not saying that there's a direct link between that statement and the particular example that I've chosen, but it is noticeable that violent demonstrations are going up, and one of the most marked took place just recently when 1,300 large delivery trucks were destroyed in the year to May 2019. And this kind of phenomenon greatly deters investment too, because it's a massive level of instability, which it demonstrates and which business is naturally concerned about.
Excellent. No, I think you can move along.
Thank you. We're going to talk briefly now about BEE and the NDR strategies and tactics which underpin that. So, of course, the obvious immediate goal is to replace people in senior jobs in the public service and SOEs in the private sector with ANC cadres committed to the movement, committed to the NDR. It also means that you get the black middle strata, which are a key motive force as well, to push for additional changes of that kind. It gives them an interest in doing so. And the aim is, of course, to change both the management and the ownership of the economy, which is part of the RET agenda, as it is intended in the end to change also the structure of the economy. At the same time, there are procurement rules in place which weaken business, which weaken delivery to, as I'll get to, by the state, and which expand opportunities for patronage. The system also keeps race classification alive. The race laws were repealed by the National Party in 1991, almost 30 years ago, and yet people are still having to classify themselves into very much the apartheid era categories. And that division into different racial groups helps to fuel racial polarization. It also makes it possible to stigmatize whites, and that makes it harder for the moderate majority, both black and white, to unite behind pragmatic policies. Look more at the NDR policies that have been introduced. We have employment equity and BEE rules that are based on an assumed norm of strict demographic representativity. In other words, that people will filter out into the society, into management posts, into the ownership of companies, and so on, strictly in accordance with their proportionate shares of the population. But that assumed norm has never, in fact, been found to exist in any heterogeneous society because it overlooks any number of relevant factors. And the relevant factors which it overlooks in South Africa are particularly salient. Age, for example, if we look at the age structure of the population, roughly half of South Africans are under the age of 25, which makes it difficult to consider them eligible for senior management posts, or even for big tenders to the state, and so on. Age and experience go together. So again, if you have a very youthful population, very many of the people in it will not have had the experience needed for senior posts. Relevant too is education, and that remains really a tragedy in South Africa, with so many schools still dysfunctional, with 78% at least of grade 4 pupils unable to read for meaning, with not surprisingly almost half of the class that starts in grade 1, grade 2 falling out before matric, with many people getting poor results. And so we don't have a well-skilled workforce coming through from the schools and able to move into these positions. And the changes also overlook the extent of the change that was already happening in any event. The white skills pool was far too small by the end of the 1960s. So even in the 1970s, the National Party government started putting more money into black education. Job reservation really fell away, and black people who increasingly were moving into more senior posts, supervisory and then management posts, in a process to which the private sector was committed because the white skills pool was too small. Our current laws require that one must have 25% black ownership at least. That's 60% to 88% black representation in management from senior to junior, that there must also be 80% BEE procurement of goods and services, and half of that 80% must come from 51% BEE firms. But unfortunately, we don't have sufficient number of those firms, so many established businesses are now also under pressure to create and then sustain new 51% BEE entities, which is a major burden on a company which may already itself be struggling. We've also had vastly increased penalties from 2014 that for repeat offences under the Employment Equity Act, firms can be fined up to 10% of annual turnover. You even have the possibility of 10 years jail for fronting under the BEE Act. And fronting is, I think, normally understood as the fraudulent misrepresentation of BEE credentials. But if you look at the wording of the Act, it's defined very much more broadly to include the unintentional undermining of BEE goals. So one must hope that no prosecutor would be so foolish as ever to try and prosecute a director for infringing that particular requirement. But we have fast implementation in the public service and the SOEs, and that because of the factors we talked about, age, experience, education, and the very rapidity with which it has done, has eroded efficiency. There's been a crippling loss of experience and of institutional memory in the public service and in many SOEs. And the upshot has been major problems in public schools. 80% of them are dysfunctional. Clinics, public health clinics, 85% of them can't comply with basic norms and standards, even on such things as standards of hygiene and the availability of medicines. Wastewater treatment plants are collapsing in the hands of dysfunctional municipalities and spewing 4 billion litres of untreated or partially treated sewage into our dams and rivers every day. Infrastructure projects can't get off the ground because we don't have the skills to manage them. As Trevor Manuel said some years ago, financial management is very poor, as successive attorneys general have, auditors general have said, again, because people with poor skills have been appointed to very senior positions. As regards public procurement, 30 to 40% of public procurement, which currently totals 800 billion a year, is tainted by fraud and inflated pricing, according to the National Treasury, and BEE plays a part in that. The 30% subcontracting rule introduced since 2017 has been particularly damaging. It's spawned what's known as the construction mafia, which is known to invade construction sites around the country, to threaten violence, to be armed with AK-47s. Sometimes arson attacks have taken place. One of the German companies that had to walk off a construction site because of all the intimidation and so on said that it had worked in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but had never seen the kind of thing it was witnessing in South Africa. BEE undermines delivery by the state, and it also deters investment, and hence the growth rate of the economy, and hence its capacity to provide more employment. And sadly, it only helps a relative elite, say 15% of the black population, according to the surveys that we've conducted, and it harms the great majority. It's also the key reason for inter-black inequality, because a small group has done very well, becoming millionaires or even billionaires, but we have those 9.3 million black people who are unemployed. And as the gap widens between those, so inequality in South Africa goes up. I want to deal briefly now with property rights and the NDR strategies and tactics there. The key goal is to eliminate existing property relations by slow degrees in this incremental way. The SACP warning that it shouldn't be done too quickly. The key focus, of course, was land reform, given apartheid injustices, but limited progress has been made. We've had limited number of transfers, about 10 million hectares. Could have been 12 million if a number of restitution beneficiaries had not preferred to take cash rather than land. But critically, there's no individual title. So restitution land goes to the communities, either to communal property associations or to traditional authorities. And land acquired for redistribution is now kept in the ownership of the state, which refuses to transfer it, to sell it to black farmers for 50 years. They must first take out a lease for 30 years and then another 20 years before they can have even an option to buy. And this is what has happened to David Rukhasi, who in his late 70s has had to turn to the courts for help in obtaining ownership of the land that he was promised a very long time ago. State custodianship of both water and mineral resources has been taken. Effectively, this has put an end to the private rights, ownership rights, which used to exist before. Bilateral investment treaties with the UK and various EU countries, which are by far the biggest investors in South Africa, were all ended by 2013, even as similar bits with Russia, China, and Cuba were retained, but those countries invest very little in South Africa. Foreign investors were promised that the Protection of Investment Act of 2015 would codify all the normal provisions in bilateral investment treaties, so they shouldn't worry about the loss of the treaties. but instead that Act provides, really the only protection it offers is what Section 25 of the Constitution provides. And Section 25 of the Constitution, the Property Clause, is now being changed to allow expropriation without compensation. This was a change that is now reflected in a constitutional amendment bill, not yet adopted by Parliament, but what it says is that there will be no compensation to be paid in various circumstances, but there's no clarity on what those circumstances might be. Parliament will decide that by ordinary legislation adopted by 51% majority from time to time. So the constitutional bill intends simply to give the legislature a blank check to decide when EWC should apply. And contrary to the promises over the entire period since the EWC demand was first made, the constitutional amendment bill does not refer just to land, but also to the improvements thereon, which includes homes, buildings, and so on. EWC is, of course, particularly damaging, and yet it's also contained in the expropriation bill. A modified version of that bill now provides for nil compensation in 6 instances, up from 5 before, and the list is not a closed one. So even in the 7th instance not covered specifically by the bill, you could still get nil compensation. It also has a narrow definition of expropriation, which essentially means that there will be no compensation for future custodial takings. For example, if all land becomes vested in the custodianship of the state, as the EFF demands, and which the ANC itself has also long wanted. And there will be no compensation for regulatory takings, where the state does not become the owner, but the existing owner nevertheless suffers a considerable loss, as would happen, for example, if 25% BEE ownership stakes have to be raised to 51%. Not the state as the owner, so not a direct expropriation, a regulatory one, but no compensation for that loss of majority control. The EWC demand is particularly harmful, and the talk of it is enough to frighten away investors and also to add to a flight of skills and capital from the country. And yet the cost of land is not the key barrier to land reform, according to the high-level panel of Parliament, which was established in 2015, to review the impact of about 1,000 post-1994 laws, including land reform ones. And if the cost of land is not the key barrier, then obviously EWC cannot resolve the real problems. And the high-level panel identified those as tiny budgets, less than 1% of the budget allocated to land reform each year, gross inefficiency, rising corruption, and no individual title, illustrated again by the problem of Mr. Rakasa, who's needed the courts to come to his aid in order to have some hope of acquiring the ownership that he was promised by the state years ago, before it in fact changed its policy to no ownership for redistribution land. If we now look at the lockdown's devastating impact and what it means for the NDR, what it means, unfortunately, I think, is that the SACP sees the COVID crisis as a key opportunity to discipline capital and the private sector, because now both are at their weakest. And in similar vein, President Ramaphosa has talked about the total destruction of the economy, has seemed almost to welcome it. He's blamed that total destruction on the virus, but of course it's the consequence of the lockdown. And why he seems to welcome it is that he sees it as the opportunity for major reconstruction, which can now be underpinned by radical economic transformation. We also have an illuminating statement from Dumisani Mpafa of the Black Management Forum, who talked about solid economic architecture, which can't easily be sabotaged unless something drastic happens. And perhaps the lockdown we've just had is that something drastic, but we can now rebuild. Dr. Makuve Masuta, who's in the ANC policy unit as a manager, has talked about an unprecedented chance to refashion society and act against the tyranny of the markets. And the SACP, at a meeting last Friday of its Central Committee, stressed again that we must shift away from the capitalist system, which it identifies as the cause of all our woes. And thus it stresses that we can't go back to the crisis before the crisis. So there seems to be a fresh impetus to key NDR interventions that the wider SACP-ANC alliance sees as an opportunity to push ahead with interventions which the balance of forces made difficult to implement before, but now in this crisis can indeed be pushed for. So in labour law, Kasati wants a moratorium on retrenchments, which is understandable, of course, with so many people losing their jobs. But on the other hand, if companies can't downsize in order to survive, then they will go bankrupt and there will be more job losses in the end. BEE, it seems, is set to remain in the provision of COVID-19 relief, even though there is no provision in the law for that. And we see new employment equity bills allowing the Labour Minister to set quotas for the private sector in the pipeline, a new BEE public procurement bill also likely to be enacted. We also have EWC in the constitutional amendment and expropriation bills, and the EFF talking about the devastation from the lockdown and saying that the solution can come only from dismantling private land ownership, which is bad news to somebody like Mr. Rakhase, who's finally on the brink of obtaining private ownership of land. There's renewed pressure for the NHI, based partly on increased rhetoric about vultures in the private sector feeding off the poor. But the lockdown has also hurt medical schemes. Many of their members can no longer afford their premiums or are having to downscale to a lower scheme. Private hospitals have seen a decline of 75% in their admissions. Private doctors have seen a sharp decline, 43%, I think is the figure, in their consultations. So they're all under some kind of financial stress. Then we have renewed focus, very much so, on prescribed assets for pension funds. The idea that Regulation 28 must now be changed so that the state can give more direction as to how pension funds should be invested. Not altogether clear how. The SACP seems to want straight prescription. The ANC has recently talked simply about making it possible for pension funds to invest in the development finance institutions, which will then manage infrastructure and other capital projects. So all of this is supposed to provide pensioners with a chance to invest in real assets, but one only has to think of the Eskom build of Madupi and Kusile to understand the risks. The price there has doubled from 150 billion to 300 billion. It may cost another 200 billion to fix them, to complete them, and then they'd need billions more to be fixed. Enormously long delays and this long list of defects, which is very serious. We also have other NDR interventions in the pipeline. The SACP has long wanted this, others are now calling for it. A wealth tax, the proposal is that this should start at 3%, that it would be levied on people whose accumulated value of their homes, pensions and other savings totals 3.6 million or more. In other words, it would catch the middle class in its net rather than the truly wealthy. It would also catch many of the public servants who now earn $1 million and must have homes and other assets which would bring them within that level. And of course, it will be particularly devastating to people who are about to retire, who have the assets that they've accumulated over a lifetime of endeavour, but very little income to pay a new tax. There's also a call for increased exchange controls, but those would be a further barrier to investment. Business would be reluctant to come here, given the many other choices they have, if they're not sure that they can get their money out again. And there would be a major change, perhaps the most damaging of all, to the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank, which according to the Constitution is primarily to protect the value of the currency in the interests of sustainable and balanced growth. But the SACP, and now also David Masondo, who is a senior figure in the party, but also the Deputy Finance Minister, has spoken of the need for quantitative easing, for printing money in essence to buy bonds directly from the Treasury and so fund government spending. And this might have been done in other countries without triggering hyperinflation, but the chances that we would avoid that are small. We're much more likely to follow the path of Zimbabwe and Venezuela, if only we're not an economy, if only because we are not the US and the dollar is not our currency. We're likely to experience massive damage from the proposed changes. We could see many more bankruptcies, many more job losses, pension savings could be reduced rather than growing. We could have the loss of homes to EWC, even to the wealth tax, so people can't pay for the tax out of their income. There's a real risk of hyperinflation from the printing of money. The private sector will shrink and millions more will find themselves dependent on the state. We've been in the situation where 70% of people could derive their livings from the private sector. That could change, and the more it changes, the more state power will grow. Yet property rights are the key to prosperity as well as political freedom, and that is evident from all around the world. There's also a fundamental fallacy that's at work here. The collectivist planners think that the economy is a product of their command and that they can pick it up off the floor when it falls, as Mamvula Mokonyane said about the Rand. And of course, anybody who knows anything about the economy knows that that is not so. And they'll also be very well aware of the enormous hardship and repression that centrally planned economies have always spawned. So as we look to the future and how the ANC might be planning to use the crisis caused primarily by the lockdown, there's great reason to be concerned about the thrust of policy and the kind of ideas that are being put forward. Thank you.
Excellent, Anthea. Thank you so much. Before I ask a few questions of Anthea that I've jotted down here as part of a bit of a conversation, I just want to say to everyone that please feel free to, in the comment or in the chat function, indicate that you want to ask a question. I will keep an eye on that and then refer to you to ask your question, to put your question to Anthea. If I do understand that technological hiccups have made these questions sometimes more difficult than would be ideal, so please feel free to contact either Anthea or myself or any of my colleagues so that we can respond to your questions. Anthea, the first question I'm going to ask you is, how does this COVID-19 lockdown, it's quite a bold claim to say that the country has been in lockdown for 10 years, and I, for one, agree with you. But what should ordinary South Africans take away from the small lockdown about the larger lockdown, about the National Democratic Revolution?
I suppose in essence that we're very fixated on the COVID lockdown, naturally, after 10 weeks of experiencing it, and the fact that it does continue in a modified form. But it is, despite the damage it's caused, the smallest part of our problems. That the economy was on its knees, on the brink of collapse, even before the COVID-19 lockdown began. And that was because of the big squeeze from the policy lockdown, particularly of the last 10 years. And that policy lockdown comes from the bad NDR policies that have been introduced over that period, which have been intensified incrementally but steadily in that time. And now we can see from the sort of rhetoric, and I think it's more than rhetoric, the documents that are coming out from the ANC, from the SACP, the statements being made by Kusatu, that there really is a belief within the tripartite alliance that this COVID-19 lockdown is an enormously important opportunity. The weakening of the private sector through the lockdown, the predominance of the rise of state power has now given the opportunity to push through with more changes. And there's another factor too, which perhaps my presentation didn't adequately touch on. The COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly highlighted the enormously difficult circumstances in which so many people live, that there are people living in informal settlements where they can't possibly social distance because they're so overcrowded, where they have to go out to queue for toilets and taps, which often don't work. These are appalling conditions to live in, appalling conditions in which many people have to come to work and overcrowded taxis over long distances. And many of these factors have some root in the apartheid past, of course, but in 26 years we could have done so much more to overcome them if we had had the right policies focused on growth, investment, jobs, and on giving people the opportunity to improve their own circumstances, as millions would then have done.
If in your report, near the end, I think in the second last paragraph, you make a point about the somewhat muted acquiescence of ordinary South Africans to this COVID-19 lockdown and how that might affect the thinking of the tripartite alliance in the willingness of the public to go along with their policies. What do you mean by that?
I think really what I meant was that when the lockdown began, I think it was broadly supported right across the political spectrum and by most South Africans. It might be, perhaps was partly a shock effect. It all happened so fast, and there we were suddenly all in our houses, businesses mostly, 80% of them closed down, the state with extraordinary, unprecedented powers. Perhaps we were just so taken by surprise we didn't know quite what to say in return. And there was, of course, a great concern about the virus and what it would mean in terms of illness and death. So if there is that sort of mute acceptance, it would, of course, make it much easier for the government to press ahead with NDR policies, which would never be portrayed in negative terms, which would always be sold as the best possible for the government and for the country, for the poor, the right way to get inclusive growth, etc. But fortunately, perhaps where we're not so much at mute acceptance level now, we've actually had a number of challenges to lockdown regulations, which are seen as unreasonable and irrational, and perhaps even to the whole concept of the lockdown and the powers of the National Coronavirus Command Council. So mute acceptance might be on the way out, and that would be a good thing.
Excellent. We have a question typed here by Brian, and so I'm going to put it to you on his behalf. The impression one gets is that the prognosis for a free and successful South Africa is now very negative. We seem to be heading towards the failed state scenario. Is this your belief?
I think we can get entirely away from it. I think that there's crisis can be used, the opportunity that the crisis presents can be used two ways. It can be used to advance the NDR, or it can be used to bring about a recognition among ordinary South Africans, and one hopes people with sufficient influence in the society to persuade the ruling party to back off plans of the NDR type and instead embrace a true new dawn, one that really would see the most dangerous, the most damaging of these NDR policies rolled back so that we can attract the investment, we can restore business confidence, we can see people wanting to come and set up new plants and factories and mines and other things, which at the moment they certainly would not do, and thereby increase the opportunities for employment. And obviously, we also have to fix the underlying factors like the very poor education system and so on. But certainly, no, I don't say this is a recipe for despair. It's really a call to action because there is hope, but we need to fight back against what will damage us further.
One of my favorite factoids of South African history is that in 1985, P.W. Botha gives the Rubicon speech where he says he will not lead white South Africa down the road of abdication and suicide. And 10 years later, Nelson Mandela walks onto the pitch at Ellis Park with 40,000 predominantly white South Africans chanting his name. And I think the reason that is so powerful to me is it really shows that change happens very gradually and then suddenly, to paraphrase Ernest Hemingway. But that gradualness is the buildup of pressure, and that's really what the ANC responds to, and what the IRR specializes in building is identifying these pressure points. And perhaps a last interesting factoid is that 10 years after 1995, the last leader of the National Party, Martinus van Schalkwyk, was sitting in an ANC cabinet as an ANC member of parliament and minister. So while that might not be the model for recovery. It certainly, I think, illustrates the changeability, the fluidity of a nation in crisis, as it were.
Indeed, it does just underscore the fact that great change is possible in quite a short space of time. And I think we also know from the polling that we've done, and other polling, for example, that done by Bill Johnson before the 2017 ANC election, that there's a hunger in the country for much more pragmatic policies, that most people are focused on what will give them good education and jobs and the opportunity to earn. They want business-friendly policies, not radical redistribution. And it's so important that those voices should be listened to.
And I think from our Hope report that the IRR publishes every now and then, looking really at the attitudes of South Africans, my favorite piece of data from that is really in response to the question, or to the statement, that with better education and more jobs, inequalities between races will disappear. And around 75% of South Africans, 73% of Black South Africans agree with that statement, saying that jobs, skills, these are the things that will bring about the equality that has been denied for more than a century now in this country.
Right. And we must stop the things that add to the inequality, such as
yes.
BEE, for which promises the opposite, but simply doesn't help the great majority.
Yes, and I think it's easy to fall into the buzzwords of South African politics, inclusive growth and all those things. But if you want to reach inclusive growth, you must first understand what's excluding people. We don't even have growth at this stage, but if we want to get to growth, we need to understand, if we want inclusive growth, what is excluding people. And that is exactly, I think, what you made very, very clear here today. So, Anthea, from my side, thank you very much. I think that we have made very good use of our time. I want to thank all journalists in attendance. Thank you for the questions that you sent through, and please feel free to engage further with us. We will be sending out a press package very soon, which would contain all the necessary information on today. I received a question on whether the slideshow will be available. Most definitely the slideshow will be available. We will be sending that out to our mailing list very shortly, to our colleagues who join us, to our friends who followed on other platforms. Thank you very much. Your support really makes it possible for us to not just identify the problems, but come up with solutions. And the IRR is in the business of finding solutions. And we wish we could say business is booming, but it certainly has a massive demand for it. Anthea, thank you so much for your time. Just perhaps a reminder, the content of today's presentation, that comes from a report that you wrote, that'll be published, right?
That's right. The report has the same title. It should be on the Institute's website very soon, as I understand it.
Excellent. Everyone, thank you very much for your time, and then we'll see you on another occasion when we can understand how we can get out of not just the small lockdown, but the lockdown that has been keeping South Africans from achieving their very great potential. Thank you.